Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our second week of Black History Month events. This particular event is honoring Charles Mills, who's one of the most prominent Black philosophers of the 20th century and into the 21st century. My name is Darryl Heller. I'm the director of the IU South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center. And I am really excited about this particular event because one of the things we try to do during Black History Month is really kind of lift up and share and expose many people in the Black community who made significant contributions that others may not know about because their work has not been as widely distributed as it could and should be. So as you can see, we're having a slightly different format this evening in that I'm not actually in person. I couldn't be there tonight. So we put a panel together that has me virtual and two of our panelists in person at the Civil Rights Heritage Center. And I want to thank George, especially for working out the details and making this possible so that we can continue to use the learning and experience that we've had in this silver lining of COVID, where we can actually broaden our reach, both in person and virtual in these type of hybrid events that we've taken up to the next level of not just having a virtual audience, but also having virtual panelists.
Oh, that didn't work.
How are we doing, George?
For some reason, we can hear you, but we can't see you. So keep going.
Okay. Well, I'll keep going because so the format for this evening is we have three panelists. I will introduce them in just a minute. And of those three panelists, I myself am one actually. But I want to do just a quick introduction or just kind of introduce you to Charles Mills, kind of just very briefly. We'll have much more to say about him and his work. And then we're going to talk about why his work is important. So first of all, Charles Mills was born on January 3rd, 1951 in London, England to Jamaican parents. He graduated from the university, from his parents were Jamaican. They met in London as graduate students at the University of London. When Charles Mills was still a child, his family moved back to Jamaica, where he spent the rest of his childhood. Mills received his BS in physics from the University of West Indies in 1971, and an MA and PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto in 1976 and 1985, respectively. He then went on to a distinguished career in philosophy at the University of Oklahoma, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and Northwestern University before ending his career as emeritus at CUNY, City University of New York's Graduate Center. Altogether, Charles Mills wrote 6 books and published over 100 articles. Much of his work revolved around political philosophy and race. His seminal text, the one that we'll be discussing tonight, is titled The Racial Contract. And in this short work, Mills forcefully articulates a counter-argument to our traditional understanding of social contract theory, and convincingly argues that the foundation of this country is grounded in white supremacy. We'll dive deeper into the content of this work in a moment, but first I want to introduce our panel. And to really capture the breadth of Mills' work, we actually drew from 3 distinct disciplines to be able to talk about Mills, his work, and the significance. So we have philosophy, history, and Africana studies represented. To your right, Louise Collins is in the philosophy department at IUSB. Dr. Collins joined the faculty at IU South Bend in 1994. She was promoted to full professor of philosophy in 2013. Dr. Collins earned her BA in politics, philosophy, and economics from Oxford University, and her MA and PhD in philosophy from McGill University in Toronto. She teaches a range of courses that include introductory ethics and critical thinking to students beginning their college careers. And she also teaches upper level classes in ethics, social philosophy, and feminist philosophy. Our next panelist, Dr. Bernard Forgoir, teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at Notre Dame. He received his bachelor's degree in theater studies and English from the University of Ghana, a master's degree in theater studies from the University of Guelph, and dual master's degrees in African studies and political science from Ohio University. He earned his PhD in African American studies from Northwestern universities, where he'll talk later. He studied and worked with the Professor Mills. Dr. Forjwuor's research and teaching interests are in the areas of critical race theory, African political thought, Black political thought, racial politics, and racial capitalism. He's currently working on the book titled Critique of Political Decolonization, that interrogates the ways that the colonial and the racial, by folding acts of self-governance and self-determination into the mechanisms of the various undertaking, predetermined liberal democratic outcomes. He reads the concept of sovereignty as a site where the colonial and the racial are transformed into democratic wills. So that's our panel. Oh, and I'm Darryl Heller. I'm a historian. And I not only direct the IU South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center, but I teach in the Women and Gender Studies at IU South Bend, where my research interest really is around race construction, and the intersections of race and gender. And I think all of the expertise that we as the panel bring, we're doing this more as a conversation that we'd like to have with you, the audience. We're going to do some introductory remarks. Each of us will in turn, but then we're going to open this up for a conversation that we'd really like to be engaged with you being active participants. So Dr. Collins is going to kick us off with a short introduction to social contract theory and introduce us to Mill's intervention in this area of political philosophy. Then I'm going to briefly describe the historical underpinnings of Mill's theory as it plays out in practice. And then Dr. Forjwuor will then speak about the significance of Professor Mill's work in the areas of Black political thought and his reflections from having studied with Professor Mills at Northwestern University. And so now I'll turn this over to Louise, Dr. Collins.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Daryl and Bernard and everybody who's here and zooming in. I really want to sort of second Daryl's invitation to think of this as a conversation. Before I start saying a little bit about this work, The Racial Contract, which has been so influential, I did want to just add a little sort of comment about Mill's biography and his significance. Speaking as somebody who's been in the academic discipline of philosophy for quite a long time, I really want to communicate the ways in which he is such an important figure. There are academic philosophy in the English-speaking world has been for a very long time and still largely continues to be dominated by white males. And so to have someone like Mills rise to such prominence and then do such powerful work critiquing a discipline which philosophy has always prided itself on sort of radical reflection and thinking through to the fundamentals of things and self-critical and being a gadfly and all that. But yet for a very long time, philosophy itself has been quite obliviously white dominated, never pausing to consider who else should be in this room, who else should be in the conversation. And that has a huge impact on the kinds of questions that get asked, the way theory gets constructed, what counts as the curriculum, what counts as important questions, and the kinds of answers that people produce. And it's also very important, of course, that as we think of upcoming generations of philosophers, are people available to be role models for all the diverse individuals who might contribute to the conversation of philosophy, but they're looking around and they're not finding mentors, or when they do find mentors, how wonderfully they flourish. Okay, so that's just a side note, because my experience really, you know, I've been to conference after conference and conference, and you know, when I started, there were hardly any women in the room. And then, you know, the place was lily white. So things are changing. There are all kinds of good things going on, but that's part of why this thinker is so important, as well as his work just taken in itself, or his sort of formal academic output is important. Okay, so his most famous work is The Racial Contract, which was published in 1997. It builds on the tradition of what's known as social contract theory in Western political philosophy. And some of the thinkers who whose names would come up in this connection would be Thomas Hobbes in 1651, John Locke, that's a name that many people would know, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and scooting forward to the 20th century, John Rawls, The Theory of Justice, and many others between. Okay, so what is social contract theory? And this is not going to be a precise, this is going to be a sort of rough and ready, here's sort of what it's like. So social contract theory offers an imaginary scenario as a device or a tool or something to think with to help us consider how societies are formed and how society should be structured and governed. So there's partly a descriptive part. How does this happen? And there's also a normative part. How should this happen? And what should a society look like? We're to imagine people living as free and equal individuals in a state of nature. Before there are stable social institutions, then opting to establish a civil society and a form of government. People come together and agree to give up some of the freedom they had in the state of nature, this sort of unregulated condition. They give up some freedom to live in an orderly society with social, economic, and political institutions that confer advantages which make it worth exiting the original state of nature. And if those institutions don't deliver, then for some social contract theorists, at least, we can justifiably withdraw our allegiance from those institutions. So, you know, part of the big idea here, which is new at the time Hobbes and so forth start writing, is that the authority of the government rests in some sense on the consent of the governed, not, for example, on the authority of tradition. Oh, it's always been like this, so it must be right. Not that, consent of the governed, and it's not tradition backed by God or divine authority or whatever. Okay. Mills works in this tradition, but with a crucial twist. He was deeply influenced by the feminist political philosopher Carol Pateman, who wrote a book in 1988 called The Sexual Contract, so not the social contract, but the sexual contract, in which she takes all these classical, canonical social contract theories to pieces and says, hey, they're talking about all people, but actually when you look closely, they're really just talking about men. And when you start thinking about, well, but does this make sense if we're talking about women too? You start to realize their theories don't actually make sense. And even worse, their theories tend to endorse patriarchy, the rule of men over women. So Mills looks at that, and evidently he's an original thinker also, but what he does is he argues that the modern political order was founded on a racial contract, okay, which excluded people of color and indigenous peoples. And really, this is a job for our historian, but Mills sort of insists you ought not to just look at the theory in isolation. Here's this clever idea of the social contract. But think about what was going on at the time these theorists were writing. What else might be going on? What else might be motivating them to construct these kinds of theories? And as these theorists were writing, this is a period of European expansion, development of colonies around the world, taking over the lands and resources of indigenous peoples, and also as part of a project of justifying why it's okay for white people to go around the world and beat people up, take their resources, take their lands, dominate over them. Part of how that is justified is by the development of concepts of race and a racial hierarchy, okay? Such that white people are, and only white people are truly persons, right? So Mills is not trying to say that once upon a time, all white people got together, sort of the tribe of white people got together and sat down around a giant table and signed a contract. But, and here's a little quotation, the racial contract is real and actual and historical in the sense of the intentional creation of white people, of racialized institutional arrangements and social practices. Okay. And he says this racial contract helps to institute and justify, again, quotation from the very start of this work, The Racial Contract, white supremacy, the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. So it's a very broad, very powerful claim. And his goals in writing this book, in theorizing in this way, he's trying to get people to see that a lot of what we, and here I'm identifying as a white person, a white philosopher even, have taken for granted as just the way things are, is actually the outcome of this racial contract, which has shaped our sense of reality, of what we believe to be true, about what is known, and about how the world works. So he believes that the racial contract has so permeated our view of the world that we don't even see profound racial injustice, let alone see it as something that needs to be fixed, that calls for rectificatory justice. Okay, we ought to set it right, where we, of course, isn't just white people, but all of us. So that's where I'll leave it. That's very broad brushstrokes. Political theorists Bernard would perhaps characterize things much more in a more careful way, but that's kind of big picture what I think he's doing in the racial contract.
Thank you, Louise.
So,
and thank you, Daryl, for the invitation. Thank you, George, for giving us voice to say some of these things that are quite impressive with Charles Mills' work. I just want to give a brief context to how I came to know Charles Mills. I studied at Northwestern. That is predominantly a white institution. And there are not that many Black voices on campus to think along with about some of these deep and provocative questions. So there was this yearly, quarterly based debate that is often organized on campus. And they bring together some of these big thinkers on campus to fight it out over a concept. And the concept that was being debated at that time was the concept of race. And it was between Charles Mills and another thinker who is in the African American Studies department called Bernard Hesse. Bernard Hesse was to argue against the concept that race is socially constructed, whilst Charles Mills was to affirm it. I've always had my suspicion about this idea of social contract, this idea about race as socially constructed, and we can go into that discussion later. So I came into this particular forum with having already decided for myself that Charles Mills will not be able to overcome the challenge of this, but he was quite persuasive. He won the debate, which was quite brilliant because Bernard Hesse was also a very brilliant political theorist at the same time. So, and what fascinated me most was that the gathering was predominantly white students and some white faculty members from it. And the minority in the audience were actually Black students, which interested me. I was like, how did they draw this kind of crowd to this kind of debate? So I wanted to learn more about his work. So I took a course with him on egalitarian justice in the philosophy department. And that is where I began this kind of relationship with him. After that, he served on my dissertation committee. And some of his work influenced mine as well. I'll touch on two things that I think I was impressed with that also influenced my way of thinking. The first one has to do with the framework of liberalism. Remember, Charles Mills is critical of liberalism, but he's not willing to go beyond liberalism. So like Louise said, all these beautiful theories we have, democracy, justice, equality, those are perfect concepts, but we often don't think about what those things mean, right? So let me give you an example. This thing over there, which is a chair, right? It's a chair. I call it a chair. But if somebody comes from another society, that they call it something different and have a different purpose to it, they'll call it different. It may happen that we are saying different things, but we mean the same thing. Does it make sense? So this can be liberalism, right? But we have a different relation to it, right? So if we look at a specific formation of liberalism, which is trade liberalization, which is the economic dimensions of liberalism, for instance, when you go to African countries to invest in that country and you're exploiting their resources, that is perfectly a good capitalist exchange, right? But to the person whose resources have been extracted from, it feels very much like exploitation. So we still are all trapped within the liberal framework, but somebody is suffering at the end of the day. So I began to ask myself this question. We talk about liberalism in this beautiful way, and yet it feels so much like exploitation. I think Charles Mills gave us the tools to be able to think about the ways in which liberalism itself can work to affirm exploitation at the same time. So that is what influenced my work in his work. There's another thing that I thought was really, really provocative in his work, because for him, the social contract is not just a political contract, it's also a moral contract, and it's also epistemological contract. I often elevate the epistemological contract over the other formations because I feel if the epistemology upon which this contract stands is weak and you can dismantle it, the other performances will not make sense anyway. So if we can sufficiently debunk the idea that democracy is good for us, nobody will practice democracy. It doesn't make sense. So the epistemological foundation is that which holds it together. So I became really seduced about this idea about the racial contract as epistemological thing. And the way to dismantle this epistemological tradition was also very important to me. So that is how I became influenced by that. To look at the system, not as self-evidential, but something that we can question, we can open apart and see how it's put together, and then we can think from there. Another interesting thing is that we have to also understand that epistemology is not just a way of thinking, the system of knowledge, but it's also tied to ontology, the way we are. So for instance, if you didn't know that this center exists, you'd never come here, right? So your being here is an affirmation of the epistemological tradition into which you're socialized, right? So it's important to understand that to dismantle this kind of exploitative politics, you have to begin from the epistemological part. So that is what my work does in relation to Charles Mills. I'll say something else, which is quite interesting in his, in one of the last articles he wrote, is entitled Criticizing Critical Theory. For him, the field of critical theory, you know, whenever you mention critical theory, it seems as if you're doing something radical, trying to shift the narrative into certain realms that we haven't been yet. But for him, the field of critical theory itself, it reinscribes itself, right, without ever going beyond itself, to think, how do people who do not believe in this thing see the world that this critical tradition is trying to engage with? So he's advocating for ways in which we can bring people with a different perspective to think about some of these big concepts. And I think it will be productive for us to go beyond the ways in which we take these things as self-evident, liberalism, freedom, and we assume that when we say freedom, we all mean the same thing. So I'll end there, but I have other comments that I'll be happy to discuss as well. So.
Great. Thank you, Bernard and Louise. And I'll pick it up and just have a couple of things to say kind of as a historian and what I think is significant, and particularly how I have been influenced by the work of Charles Mills, and particularly his work in the racial contract. Because as both Louise and Bernard shared, Mills argued that his social contract was not only normative, that is kind of explaining how things should be, but it was also descriptive, that it actually gave an explanation of how things are. And where he diverged and where he made an argument, and that I kind of take to heart, is that while most contract theory, social contract theory, is kind of a thought experiment, as Louise said, it's not like people actually got together and formed a contract and made these agreements and these are the people that are affected, but it's an explanation of how government comes to be, why we're obligated to follow laws, and to kind of give some justification for those kind of political theories. But Mills argued that the racial contract actually is grounded in history. There is actually material, concrete basis to underpin the racial contract. And so I'll just talk briefly, about what that looks like from the U.S. context. But he would also say that it's not just, within the U.S. context, but it's within the context of conquest and exploitation, and particularly white supremacy as kind of not just a phenomenon within the United States, but it's a worldwide phenomenon. So we'll just start where Mills notes at the beginning of the racial contract that the social contract that is embodied in our Constitution, most famously in We the People, and that's kind of the giving of consent. We the people have consented to what's going to follow from here. That's the preamble. Mills argues that it's not this universalist language of we the people was actually not inclusive, that we the people were actually the people who count, and that actually the people who counted were only white people. So under the ideology of white supremacy, as Mills would spin it out, the political philosophy of justice and inclusion and freedom and equality is the normative view that guides social relations, but only for those who are considered white. All other people of African descent, indigenous people, Asians, other non-Europeans, the political philosophy that governs their social relations is largely used by terms such as the doctrine of discovery, conquest, imperialism, colonialism, white settlement, apartheid, cultural genocide. Like those are kind of unequal political economies and political philosophies that are applied, though they're disguised somewhat through the universalist language that is used in these documents. So we know that the country, and the country as in the US, was founded on conquest and by occupying stolen land from indigenous people who were labeled as savages and therefore unfit to participate in the social contract. The stolen lands themselves, upon which the colonies were enriched, was made possible by the stolen labor of stolen people of African descent, who were largely an enslaved population, which also excluded them from the social contract that is embodied in the Constitution, and actually the first 12 amendments of that Constitution as well. So the racial contract was entrenched in the early growth of the nation, beginning with George Washington, considered by patriots, by the way, as the father of the country. Beginning with George Washington, 10 of the first 12 presidents owned slaves, 8 of them while they served as president. And likewise, several Supreme Court justices were slave owners, as were a significant number of the men who sat in Congress in the early national period. And this points, and we'll open this up more to what Bernard was saying, that this has shaped part of the epistemological framework of which they were operating for sure in the policies and laws and practices and social relations that grew out of those power relations. The Washington Post actually did a long study on Congresspeople who were slave owners and found that 1,700 Congresspeople either owned slaves or owned slaves at one time in their life, all the way up until the 20th century. In that for the first 30 years of American lawmaking, between 1789 and 1819, more than half of the men elected to Congress each session were slaveholders. Now, that of course, says something about what kind of contract was embodied and who was included and who was excluded. And it found its way into the Constitution itself. Historian David Waldstreicher has noted that the US Constitution contains 6 clauses that directly concern slavery and the slaves and their owners, with an additional 5 other clauses that indirectly related to slavery. And this kind of began with the 3/5 clause that dictated that 3/5 of the numbers of slaves in any state would be count toward that state's representation in Congress. These references also included the federal guarantee to create a militia to put down insurrections, most notably any slave insurrection, that the federal government committed itself to ensuring that the institution would be maintained. The Constitution allowed for the international African slave trade to continue for 20 years beyond its ratification, but there was no end date set for the internal slave market and the internal slave trade, which continued up until the Civil War and the legal ending of slavery. And the fugitive slave clause that's embedded in the Constitution that guaranteed the return of escaped slaves regardless of where they fled. So these are all components that form the contract that we think of as democracy and freedom in these words that we use in this very inclusive way that, you know, in the actual formation and the structures that were produced out of them was much more narrow and exclusive. So needless to say that, as Mills would note, the structure and authority of this new government was based on the contract that allowed only white people to hold power and determine the policies and practices of free men. And free men were decidedly did not include non-white people. Entering the body politic, even how the citizenry and who was included at the beginning of the contract, you have to make account for who can become members of that contract, who can sign on to it. And so it was very clear from the very beginning that this contract, as you know, we call our body politic, was exclusively the prerogative of white people. And this was embodied in the first Naturalization Act of 1790, which made it allowed only free white people to become naturalized citizens. And some form of exclusion of non-white people from citizenship continued until 1952, just as a point of reference. And then, of course, there's the infamous Dred Scott decision in 1857 that stripped any legal foothold to citizenship from people of African descent. And that ruling required a constitutional amendment to change. It was changed with the 14th Amendment in 1868. The racial contract, kind of in this way that Mills spun it out, continued in the post-emancipation era as the short-lived period of Reconstruction came to an end in 1877. And by the mid-1890s, the vast majority of people of African descent have been disenfranchised from their voting rights and their ability to sit on juries, which put them fully at the mercy of whites in the dispensing of justice. The nation sat idly by to this day when no anti-lynching bill has come across on the federal level, as 4,000 Black people were lynched while people were desperately making efforts to pass anti-lynching legislation that was doomed to fail in an all-white Congress. That just kind of continued to shore up the contract as a racial contract. And the racial contract is in full force, even as a second effort at Reconstruction was growing. That second effort at Reconstruction is what we call the Civil Rights Movement. While that movement had a measure of success in changing the kind of legal, the de jure formal trappings of Jim Crow and segregation, the terms of the contract itself were never confronted. And I think we can kind of unwrap that a little bit in our conversation. But the structures and institutions and practices that define white supremacy are most visible today in the attack on voting rights that is being waged as we speak. White supremacy as an institution, as the underpinning of the contract, is a little more frayed today than it was in 1787. But it remains entrenched, and though we see the kind of fighting back and resistance in the effort to maintain the contract, the racial contract as in white supremacy, as it was conceived and has kind of formed the structures and institutions, We see it in the attacks on critical race theory. We see it in the ways that legislation is being promulgated in various states, trying to determine what content and in what manner the history of the country can be taught. We see it in just today, I believe, the US Supreme Court failed to the Supreme Court let stand a gerrymandered congressional map in Alabama that a lower court ruled violated the Voting Rights Act. And so this ongoing effort to destabilize what Mills described theoretically as a racial contract, but also grounded in the kind of historical trajectory of the nation, this nation itself. But all in all, his theory, and I'll kind of stop here, but this theory of the racial contract, as Mills claimed, has historical purchase in the real world. And it's clear, as he pointed out, that it's not just in the US context, but in the realm of Western conquest, imperialism, and settler colonialism. And so we see it replicated in Canada against indigenous populations there, in Australia against Aboriginal people, in South Africa and other parts of the African continent, in the various forms and versions of apartheid that were instituted, and in the colonization of different parts of Asia. So this Western Enlightenment ideological view of freedom, equality, and inclusion has really kind of been not smoke and mirrors, but smoke and mirrors to create an epistemological and ideological perspective that covers over oppression and exploitation. So that's kind of just a quick historical view of how I think about, for sure, the manifestation in the material way of a racial contract that forms what we think of as, the bastion of liberty and freedom, and American exceptionalism. But what we find, and I think what Mills is critiquing in part, is that we're actually not that exceptional. That we were just carrying out many of the same practices and ideological positions that Europe used and exported throughout the world, and particularly out from the global north to the global south. So I will stop there. And so I want to just open this up to all of us. And also at this point, we're opening it up to the audience also. But Bernard, I'm going to just ask you if there's anything more you wanted to say, and for you as well, Louise, how relevant is Mills' work today? And I know you said that it certainly influences some of how you think, Bernard. Yeah. But if you wanted to say anything about that.
Yes, certainly. And I refer to one other thing. The name is Arundhati Roy. He has this book on the field notes to democracy. In that book, she conceptualized this idea, she called the theft of language. And the theft of language is a very powerful way of thinking about the ways in which we are denied of the vocabulary and the concept to name the ways in which some of this barbarisms, genocide still continues, but we have named it differently. So if you take Charles Mills' work on that level, you see what he's trying to say is that instead of thinking about the foundations of this nation as built on a social contract, we should think more so of it as built on a racial contract. Right? Mm-hmm. Because the social contract, the foundation of the social contract is still fictitious. It's a fiction, right? And we had to replace it with the things that were actually happening around that time, where the invocation of the Declaration of Independence also meant that we are banishing Native Americans on this land to reservations, where it also meant that we are affirming the subjugation and slavery of of Black people. And those who were signing this contract themselves owned slaves at the same time. So in that sense, we had to situate, once you bring the social contract down to the very things that were happening around that, you cannot call it a social contract. It has to be a racial contract. So that is how I'm reading Mills. And I think that way of reading is quite useful because it allows you to question certain things that originally we were not able to. So for instance, you question when the Declaration of Independence, I think Darryl mentioned this when he said, we the people. What does the people mean when Native Americans are in the reservations and Black people are still slaves? Are we referring to everybody or specifically to white men? We also have to understand that white women were disenfranchised at the same time. So who are we referring to? Who are the people? Right. So those are the things that I think Mill's work did. It gave us the permission to question things that are considered self-evident truth that are often not questioned. Big concepts like justice, equality, and freedom. What do they mean? Are they, and for the most part, you see the ways in which some of these concepts themselves are built on this, what he called ideal theory, the fiction, rather than any specific historical moment, right? So I think that is how I use his work in my work as well.
Mm-hmm. You know, I was just thinking about what you were saying. Like I'm teaching a class this semester called Gender Injustice, and we're actually looking at, actually this week, kind of slavery and looking at the way that the legal structures that differentiated Black women from white women in the colonial period, whereas all women were disenfranchised, it was only Black women that were enslaved.
Absolutely.
And it was only Black women that were not citizens.
Yep.
Certainly, you know, after 1857. But you know, when we, and it's kind of important how we use words, and I think what you're saying is so important, Bernard, like naming things and what do we mean when we say these words? Because we talk about, you know, some of you heard me say this, but it infuriates me when I hear someone say America's the greatest country in the world. And I want to, you know, what I want to ask is like, how are you defining great? You know, in that sense, and what does it mean, and who's included in that, and what's the history that produced it? Yeah. And these are the kinds of things I think we have to get at. I mean, from a very basic level of what do we mean when we say women? Which women are we talking about? To what do we mean when we say free? Because, you know, one of the saying is that freedom is for those who are free and equality is for those who are equal. And so the freedom, not for the unfree. Sorry, people. But we think of it as inclusive, even when it's not. Another thought that I've had, and we skirted around in that because I don't know that last article you mentioned, Bernard, but I do know that Charles Mills has been thought of as kind of contributing to critical race theory, like the racial contract and some of his other work. Have you thought about that at all? Like the relationship of, because Mills didn't, I don't think, explicitly talked about critical race theory that I know of.
Yeah. I think the fact that he didn't mention it does not mean he wasn't doing critical race theory, right? So if you look at the framework of critical theory itself, and I'm thinking specifically about Foucault, who wrote directly on this issue. For him, the idea of critical theory is the refutation of the system of dogmatism, or what he called the authority of dogmatism. Remember, when the Enlightenment was coming into being, they were resisting the religious traditions that dictated how they should think and all that. So the Enlightenment and the secularist turn there was a triumph over this kind of dogmatism. And that is where they locate the idea of critical thinking. I think what Charles Mills is doing, which is I think very, very provocative, is that he's also questioning the blind side of the Enlightenment at the same time, because at the same time as well, the Enlightenment and all its advocates were also advocating for colonialism, imperialism, and racism at the same time, right? So in many sense, critical theory in that sense also represents a violation of the humanity of African and Black people as well. So for me, Charles Mills' work on the racial contract and other ideas that he has espoused is a critical interrogations of some of these things we think are beyond the constraints of barbarism, genocide, and other stuff, right? So when you mention freedom, we automatically think that this is a good concept that can be applied to everybody. But you only need to interrogate it and ask, whose freedom? How are we even putting this concept together? What does it mean? Freedom to do what, right? Because remember, during the slavery, the slave era, right? A slave running from the plantation to be free is considered a fugitive. So the Black body trying to embrace freedom becomes a fugitive of law, right? So when we say freedom, it does not necessarily mean that we are saying the same thing. And this is what he's pushing against. And that's where it becomes, this is where it becomes very powerful within the framework of critical race theory. Because for him, he's looking at critical theory from the lens of race, which gives him a very totally different account of reality. Yeah. Yeah.
So I remember in a previous short conversation we were having, you had articulated some questions that, I mean, as I read Mills, he thinks there's still life in the liberal framework, that appealing to these concepts of equality, individual rights, freedom, these are still useful ideas, particularly, you know, if you look around the world, there's this sort of the rise of authoritarianism. You know, there are real challenges facing even our flawed democracies, you know, are looking pretty good compared to some other possible alternatives. So what are your thoughts on that? I was really interested when you were mentioning that earlier.
I think this is where I'm careful about, well, I disagree a little bit with Charles Mills. So Charles Mills is critical of liberalism, but he believes that liberalism can be repaired because some of the ideas that it espouses are really, really positive. But this is how I think about it. And think along with me over here. Okay, so if, you know, often when we look at the capitalist structure, right, the top 1% at the top, and then we have the middle class, and then the down is the exploited population, or the proletariat, as they would call it. So we have this pyramid, right? But the way I think about it is that you have to understand that because capital or money is not infinite, right? The more the top 1% has, the less people at the bottom will have, right? So if that is the case, and Charles Mills is affirming liberalism or the capitalist structure we should repair, it means that the people at the bottom will have mobility up there, right? But that also translates into the 1% or those who have more losing money. Right? But that is not capitalism, is it? It's more so like socialism. So in that sense, for liberalism to succeed, it will implode. It won't be liberalism anymore. It will be something else, right? So that is where we disagree. I think liberalism is meant to build on its own failures. So it perpetuates that failure. It persistently fails in order to exist. So if you want to repair that system, you necessarily inscribe some of these failures into its mechanism. I'm thinking of a way in which we can go beyond it. We can definitely organize a society where maximization of profit, the ways in which capitalism has become our morality, we can eliminate that and live peaceably with everybody, right? Call me an idealist, but I don't think it's important for somebody to have so much money. For what? I mean, while other people are suffering. I think that is my problem. And I think one thing we also haven't thought about is US represent about 5% of the global population. It consumes about 30% of its natural resources. This is not sustainable, right? If every country is consuming like the US is consuming, we will need about 5 Fs to sustain us. Right, so you have to understand this. Where are they getting the resources from? Somebody has to suffer in order for the US to live comfortably as they do. Right? So in that model, liberalism is not going to work. That is not the solution to this problem. Right?
Is there a name for the solution?
I don't have one yet. But I think we can intervene with ethics, right? And I'm thinking about ethics in the ways Emmanuel, I forgot his name, he's a Jewish philosopher. He talks about ethics as the face of the other, right?
So I vow.
Levinas, yeah.
Okay.
Levinas was thinking about ethics as the face of the other. And this is how I'm reading it, right? If the consideration of the most vulnerable in our society drives our motivation, we will reorient our society in this kind of radical way. And the fact that the other systems that are messed up is not a reason to double down on liberalism, right? That is what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Can I jump in and follow up on that? Because I think that's a really interesting point. I was I'm a philosopher as well, and this book specifically, The Racial Contract, sort of set the trajectory of my philosophical study. So I've read The Racial Contract and some of his other works as well. And I share your sort of frustration. I've had some conversations with Mills as well about his kind of optimistic view of liberalism, and I tend to be a little bit more critical of it. But I think one of the most interesting and promising aspects of his work in books like From White Marxism to Black Radicalism is that he does leave that possibility open. Like I'm not sure a lot of people realize, like Mills was sort of a fairly orthodox Marxist before he became sort of quote unquote famous through The Racial Contract. I mean, he wrote his dissertation on the Marxist concept of ideology and published some other sort of fairly orthodox things. And in those texts where he talks about sort of defends liberalism, he also says, like, I do think it's possible that you could develop a kind of historical materialism that takes race seriously. It's just that there haven't been very many Marxists who have done it successfully. He points to a couple of promising things, like Cheryl Harris on whiteness as property, as one kind of example of a way to think that through. But I think that there are some really kind of tantalizing comments in Mills' works where he says, like, okay, what would it mean to develop a real critique of capitalism that takes seriously the sort of ideals of liberalism, freedom, and equality, and so on. I think some of the work that's being done now on racial capitalism kind of draws on those insights in really interesting ways. So thanks for this discussion. This is really, really great.
Thank you, Drew. I mean, one of the things, as Bernard was talking and what you just kind of said, it's like, it seems to me in some ways to like really do this, we have to disaggregate liberal democracy from capitalism.
Absolutely.
Because certainly in the worldview we occupy in the US, I mean, those two are conjoined, that they're like Siamese twins. Neither can live without the other, right? And they feed each other. But they're two distinct things. And where we assume that democracy requires capitalism, and that's just one of the biggest fallacies out there that I think people have been hoodwinked with. And I think that's kind of one part of the pathway to finding a solution, so to speak. But I think it has to start, that has to be a part of where that solution is operating. in that disaggregation.
Yeah, and I think that the idea of democracy is a very powerful concept if applied well, right? It's just that in our system we've perverted it, right? So, and this is what many people don't think about, because this happened in Algeria, which is quite interesting, right? And I think Derrida wrote about this, right? Where the people decided that they don't want democracy anymore. What would you call that? Is that still democratic if the people are refusing democracy itself, right? So within the democratic system itself is built its own idea of self-refutation. And we have to allow that for democracy to survive. But in bringing liberalism, what we call liberal democracy together, which means that the democratic system has to always reaffirm capitalism as its end goal, which is what Fukuyama and other people are writing about. It's quite damaging to the democratic system itself. That is why Noam Chomsky does not call US system democratic. He thinks it's a plutocracy, the rule by the most powerful and rich in our society. This is not democratic at all. But this is the system we are imposing on other countries to follow, even if it's not democratic. So yes, I agree with that. I agree with the sentiment that democracy can be redeemed from that. But I don't think it will remain this idea of liberalism that Charles Mills is advocating for. That is my personal view on this. Yeah, and to your comment, the earlier comment, I thought this is quite interesting because I think getting to the latter part of his work, I think he has moved on somewhat from this Marxist tradition from which he was open to something beyond liberalism, right? He has it seems as if he has doubled down, getting to the latter part of his work on liberalism itself, which is where we had a lot of disagreements on. And interestingly, he recommended this book for me, which is also very critical of his work, because I raised these objections with him. It's written by Domenico Luzzardo, his Liberalism and Counter-History. Very, very fascinating book. So yeah, I think there are possibilities, but it's difficult to conceptualize. Of course, racial capitalism is a very interesting field. And this is would be my last comment, and some people will jump in, right? So we also understand that capitalism created the class system and the racial system. We often talk about them as if they are the same thing, but they are not. And this is how we can distinguish them. Obama, he was the most powerful person in the world, but he still was racialized. Right? So it doesn't matter whether you have mastered the capitalist system or the class system and risen up to the master level, you still can be racialized, which means that race and class are not the same thing. They are quite distinct. And using the Marxist argument, which is the solution for the class problem, right? The proletariat rising up and dismantling the structure, it won't work for race in that same way. So racial capitalism is a better way of thinking. We're outside the constraints of capitalism, I think.
Let me ask you a really basic question, because I think it may help some of the folks in our audience. When we say liberalism, what are we talking about? What do we mean? Just kind of what does liberalism mean?
So a viewpoint that people should be equal, that they are endowed with rights, usually understood as rights not to be interfered with, negative rights. So often the right to private property is seen as central, which is understood as a right that others must respect. Others must not remove your private property, the right to physical integrity. Help me out.
Yeah, I think he's saying that all the beautiful stuff about it, and it's correct. Except of course, in addition to that, I think Dan Campbell has this short article on what is liberalism. And for him, he charted the history of liberalism, and it is filled with contradictory ideas, right? So which it's often impossible to organize into a very coherent things that we say about liberalism is all about freedom and justice. We also have to understand that somebody like John Calhoun, who was once the vice president of the United States, he was a liberal in every sense. He avowed some of these ideas, and yet he also believes that slavery was good. Does it make sense? So in many sense, there's no clear defined boundaries of liberalism, but the way I make sense of it, liberalism remains an umbrella. It has a political arm and has an economic arm. The political arm has to do with liberal democracy, or democracy as we know it. The economic arm it goes into capitalism, but they interact, right? It's all these ideas and more. Right? And that is why it's difficult to affirm it without also reinscribing some of these negative attributes at the same time, right? And if we
I was going to say, one of the other components that I think of as liberalism is the kind of primacy of the individual. And so when we think rights, we think individual rights, not collective rights, not group rights, but it's my private, my individual right to property that's sacrosanct.
Yeah, and I think that's also one of the deceptions we have, right? As if, think about it this way, the idea of individual rights or individual liberty, who gave it? It's not even derived from the self. It's something that is imposed on it by the collective. I do this exercise with my students, which is quite interesting, right? So I ask my students, okay, when you stood in front of the mirror today, what did you see? Often everybody would say, I saw myself and stuff. And I asked them, why is it that you didn't see the mirror that reflected that image to you? It fall outside your purview. Why is that? Right. And another question is that, are you sure what you're seeing is you? Right. Because if you have to identify this chair as a chair, you might have a reference somewhere to show you that this is a chair. But have you seen your own face before without that reflection? And I was like, no, we haven't. So how are you sure that you, it's because we depend on other things in order to affirm the self. So in many sense, the idea of the self does not even make sense unless it's dependent on something else, right? So, and we have built a whole system that is based on individualism, which I think is quite disturbing, right? Yeah. And that's why we had to be socially responsible, by the way, sorry.
I just want to jump in really quickly just to ask a question that we had online too, and also to mention that for any of our in-person guests, if you want to ask a question too, come back here and we'll get you on the microphone so that everybody online can hear you too. Great question from April Ladinsky, who says, wonderful discussion. How do Mills's insights help us understand the resistance to recognizing the colossal dimensions of racist and sexist structures by some people, usually those who benefit from those structures?
Right.
Anybody want to take a stab at it?
April, you stumped our panelists.
Well, I think that his the sort of talk about how the epistemological is political, how what we see, what we believe to be the case is deeply influenced by, as you say, who benefits from what, that seems like part of the answer. But even as you posed the question, April, you were suggesting that. So I don't know.
And this is why I take his idea about epistemological traditions is very, very important, right? I often say that if somebody convinces you that a poison is a healthy drink, and you drink it, taking the person at his word, you will die, and the person will blame you for being ridiculous or crazy for taking that, right? So the debate has to start from dismantling the traditions upon which some of these things, performances, policies, laws are built. And once we make it unsustainable, I think we will reform. We'll begin to think about race as something that has to be front and center in our policies and how to remedy it. And this actually scares me. The current debate about critical race theory in this country, where people are being silenced from talking about histories of race and slavery and stuff like that. But I was listening to NPR this morning and I think this afternoon, and they were talking about the initiative that is being built in Florida, for instance, banning everything. If anything has been taught in the class that makes anybody uncomfortable, should not be taught. I was like, what if Black people decide that whatever history they have been taught makes them uncomfortable because it doesn't account for their experiences? Would that also be accepted? Which means that this is quite crazy, right? We are getting to a point where you go to school and you will not be taught anything in school because it makes everybody uncomfortable. But yeah, this is some of the things. We have to dismantle the epistemological traditions that are allowing some of this narrative to permeate into the social and public arena. So.
Yeah, no, and I'll just add that I heard that same NPR piece, and my thought is like, well, what if learning about George Washington makes me uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Does that get canceled, or is does my uncomfortableness count as much as white kids' uncomfortableness?
Yep.
And I think that, kind of the unwrapping, again, it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, like naming things and like really being clear. Like uncomfortable for who? Like we the people includes who?
Mm-hmm.
That those are the kind of fundamental questions that I think kind of the resistance, I think it was April was asking, these colossal dimensions of racism, sexist structures, is really kind of working to call things for what they are, not for what they have been presented as.
Yes.
Another question from online. Do you know why Mills diverged from Marxism and how Marxism continued to inform his ideas post the move away?
I have no idea. We never had that conversation, but my suspicion is that he also realized how difficult to keep at this Marxist tradition and to answer the problem of race, which often does not work. That's my suspicion. And even the post-Marxist formulation of this, some of this problem by Foucault, by Derrida and other people, they're quite limited. That is why they remain silent on the racial problem as well. So that would be my suspicion, but I never had a conversation with him or read anything that shows that. But he really, really believes in liberalism. He thinks it can be remedied and make it work for everybody. Yeah.
Can I jump in real quick there?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you had anything to add to that, Drew.
I'll speak just briefly to the first part of the point, like why he diverged from Marxism. I think it was because so much Marxism at the time was committed to actually a similar kind of color blindness that more traditional liberalism was, right? That Orthodox Marxists said like, well, yeah, racism is a problem, but the real problem, the fundamental problem is class exploitation, right? And if you resolve class exploitation, if you overcome capitalism, the other things, racial exploitation, gender exploitation will wither away, right? And feminists and anti-racist theorists were just not satisfied with that answer, and they said so. And Mills especially, I think, said, no, we need a separate, independent analysis of structures of racial oppression. They're not just superstructural, dependent on forms of class exploitation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Any other question?
Yeah, are there any other questions or any other comments that are just comments that folks are taking away from this discussion?
I have one. So my question is actually fairly broad. So how do you make an ethical society?
Ooh.
Well, you take people in a state of nature.
Oh, boy.
It's a big question.
Mhm.
But also, if the answer is ethics, then where do you start?
I think we need to reorient ourselves. Okay, so it's a big problem, and this is the idealist in me coming out. Okay, so it's a big problem for us to turn the whole university experience into a vocational training project. And that when students are coming to school, they are looking for courses that will make them marketable, developing certain skills that will be marketable and expanding the capitalist system itself. It's no longer education for its sake, but education for what I'll get out of it. So, and the university are hiring people who can double down on these capitalist principles, transforming our business schools into centers of teaching morality about greed and selfishness and exploitations. Right? We are not, and it's like we are caught up in this thing, and there's no way out of it. I think the conversation should go to the roots of fundamental change in how we structure our systems of knowledge, right? And this is what I tell people. If you have harmed sections of your country, people in your country, and you haven't sufficiently addressed it, that harm will fold into every other initiative that is done. And I think Du Bois puts it very beautifully, is that people who have been harmed should be given the chance to attend to their own problem. And let me put it pictorially this way. So before a race, right? And before you race with somebody, you cut the legs of somebody, and you say, okay, let's leave this society of barbarism. We're no longer going to cut anybody else's legs. But we should forget about that. So now let's run as equal. Of course, you've gamed the system in ways that you're always going to win the race, right? And this is where the harm falls into even systems of equality. Equality can now be weaponized against people who are already vulnerable, who have been exploited for centuries. By the way, colonialism for centuries, 4 centuries in most places. And we don't think about that. Nobody is even giving careful thought about how do we remedy these things. And as long as we are not remedying it, the harm is still there, it's folding, it's doubling, it's tripling. At some point, we have to deal with this, right? And now we are even trying to deny people of the language to name this by banning critical race theory. My goodness, that's really serious, right? So,
I think that, kind of what that's looked like practically is the backlash against affirmative action after the successes of the civil rights movement, when suddenly, we dismantled the legal structures, or at least the legal labels of Jim Crow. Now suddenly we live in the colorblind society, and reverse racism becomes a serious, is taken seriously. Again, I think in part because of this holding on to individual rights.
Yeah.
And now the rights of white people are being, disregarded. In a nominally colorblind society that is built, that has historic injustices that can't be righted. And so I think one of the ways to build an ethical society is tell the damn truth. Let's just start with that.
Absolutely.
And I really do believe that we fundamentally, necessarily, it's not sufficient, but it is absolutely necessary that we do tell the entire truth about the history of this country that accounts for race, racism, white supremacy, and call them for what they are. And we can actually have real conversations about it. Because if we're all then using a similar framework, or at least a similar perspective of understanding of what produced the world we live in, then we can talk collectively about how to actually engage it from much more of a vantage point of being co-creators versus hierarchical subjects in it. And so, but without the truth, I mean, you know, so movements like banning critical race theory and denying even the language and the context and the environment to have those conversations is just going to fold it, you know, as you said, Bernard, fold it back on itself in a way that creates more damage, creates more harm, and creates less of a space to find our way out of it.
Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, I joked and I said, you know, well, let's go back to the state of nature, and that's exactly what you don't do is the message, I think, of Mills, right? We don't go off into this imaginary world of ideal theory, where what he's talking about by ideal theory is theory that pretends that the past didn't happen, that the effects of history have been neutralized, that there are no inequalities. Everybody has legs. Everybody is starting the great race of life from the same starting line. Equality of opportunity is enough for everybody to have a fair chance in life. But if we start by sort of muddling through what he calls non-ideal theory, that sort of starts from where we actually are, trying to tell the truth, trying to listen to other people we haven't heard from, or, you know, paying attention to multiple perspectives, not just the people in the ivory tower or the really rich people or the people who control media, but listening to people from the ground up, you know, and not trying to have some grand theory, but sort of local, small scale listening. This kind of work, I think, is actually kind of how you get to a more ethical society. You know, rather than trying to have a grand blueprint or white print or whatever it is and impose it, we kind of muddle our way up from smaller engagements with other people.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There is just a comment in the chat from Tanita. She writes that those who claim to love America and be so proud of its history want to remove the teachings of critical race theory. If they're so proud, then why do they fight so hard to remove the history they claim to be so proud of? And I think that just gets to the fundamental contradiction of, you know, this moment we're in. You know, that, you know, I love America so much that I want to squash anyone from criticizing it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one of my fears also is that if this project of silencing succeeds, we'll come to a point when colonization and slavery will become normalized again. And this is why the US population is declining, and we know that. We are advocating seriously against people coming in to support our systems. So I ask myself this question: 50 years from now, is this decline gets really entrenched? How do we meet the daily necessity of American people? Remember, we are over-consuming. How do we do that? Colonialism will become justifiable adventure again, because if you can produce it here, you have to look for this thing somewhere else, and that is my fear now, right? So.
Well, that's a happy note, Bernard.
I am idealist, but I also fear a lot. I mean,
yeah, I think that's healthy.
Yeah, And I think we have to restore humanity all over again. And we have to be very careful about how we define who the human is and the kind of rights that should be inalienable to it. I think we haven't done a sufficient job at that. The black body is always either non-human, the property, or 3/5 of a human being. We haven't actually addressed the full humanity of the black person. And as long as we haven't done that, it will consistently haunt us in whatever we do. Yeah, Darryl.
No, I was just going to say, and just kind of, similarly with the indigenous body that we've that we've removed actually, so that there's actually no, to the extent possible, to the extent we couldn't fully exterminate, the First Nations peoples, we've removed them so that they're not a factor to be considered.
Yeah.
And we have to rehumanize that as well. But, in talking to a colleague the other day, just kind of generally speaking, is like, how do we undo you can't undo the experiment because the damage that has been done is like, but what we have to do is figure out how to reconceptualize and do it in a way that's not fully using the same framework and the same structures that are producing it. We have to find a way kind of in some ways to get underneath it or challenge it to dismantle it.
Yeah.
Because the structure is just kind of replicates itself in the same way that putting a black president, in the White House doesn't change the structure of this disfigured form of democracy. So we have to challenge what we even mean by the fundamental terms that we're using and redefine them and reorient them to develop different kinds of relationships. At least that's my optimism.
That's a good question though, about ethics. I like that.
So any last questions, thoughts, and or comments before we close this? In the chat, I strongly encourage people to read The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wingrove about many of the things discussed today. So a book titled The Dawn of Everything is recommended in our chat. So we're right at time. Begin relatively on time. We'll try to end relatively on time. I want to thank you both, Louise and Bernard, for your wealth of information and contribution. Thank you, Drew, for joining in with us. Thank those in the audience virtually who asked questions and joined us, and those in person. This is one of many events we're having this month for Black History Month. So join us next week. There's a pop-up university conversation that I'm having on critical race history, not critical race theory, but you're going to help me figure out what critical race history is, because I think it's something really important. We'll be celebrating Malcolm X on the 21st, which we do every year, just to kind of lift up Malcolm. And on February 23rd, we are having an event reflecting on the contributions of Toni Morrison. That I think is critically important, and we'll end our month with the Poetry Den. So stay tuned, there's more to come, and I really appreciate all of you. Thank you, and have a good night.
Thank you, Darryl.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.